In this section, we will talk about experiments and the real world. We will mainly focus on laboratory experiments in which you want to, for example, better understand the key drivers of a certain behavior. When you set up a laboratory experiment, you should concentrate on the most interesting aspects of the environment. So you should abstract from unnecessary details. And there is the link to models or maps. So like models or maps, experiments should not pursue realism, but should really focus on those aspects you're most interested in. So an experiment should always be made as simple as possible. This simplicity enhances control. Often it helps to use neutral language. Otherwise, participants might involuntarily, for example, connect certain behaviors with certain situations, and so you're not testing what you want to test. This means you need to capture the key aspects to get valid conclusions. Here I want to talk a bit about validity of experiments. Critics often claim that the external validity of laboratory experiments is quite limited. Where here we want to generally talk about this accusation. So let us start with internal validity. So validity is the question of how valid are our experimental findings for the real world. So for looking at internal validity, we have to ask the question, does the experiment successfully represent the model or the theory in the laboratory? Does it test the model? Then we also have to ask if the external validity is given. Can the observed effect be transferred to other settings or to reality? If you have doubts about the validity of an experiment, or you can also have doubts about the theory of a model, think about what is different in the outside world and how this would change the results. Maybe the incentive structure is not salient, maybe the participants do not have enough time to build up experience. All these are possible critiques which can then be addressed. So this means the critique can then turn into new experiments, or as written here, such skepticism can result in new experiments and contribute to the scientific progress. Here, I want to quickly compare differences between experimental economics and experimental psychology. I would claim that the experimental work done in operations, in behavioral operations especially, is more closely related to experimental economics than to experimental psychology. So let's have a look. Experimental economics is more interested in outcomes and actual behavior. In contrast to that, experimental psychology is often more interested in the internal processes that underlie certain mental activities, for example. So experimental econ and experimental OM, they typically focus on behavior in specific situations. I mean, we think of how can we design these institutions such that the participants, workers, or whoever will perform as we wish. On the other hand, psychologists rather study behavior in absence of institution. They think that in this way they can get some pure insights. In OM and econ, we have a very close relationship between the experiments and the formal, typically game theoretical models. which means we have our models, we derive hypotheses, and then we test these predictions often in experiments. And often we also want to incorporate the insights from our experiments back into the theoretical models. On the other hand, if you look at experimental psychology, there's a rather loose relationship between the experiments and pre-established theories. Experimental economists and OM people are very concerned about the salience and consider clear incentives as necessary, which means you will, if you participate in an econ experiment, you will typically always get paid. In contrast to that, in experimental psychology, they are way more casual about defining the incentives, often offer no rewards. And what they typically claim is that you should, if you participate in experiments, they tell you that you should imagine yourself in a certain situations and assume that this already gives you the right incentive. So you can see there are quite some differences between experimental OM, experimental econ, and experimental psychology on the other hand. We make one more note here. Economists, they never lie to their subjects. On the other hand, psychologists sometimes or often do. The economists and OM people, they are convinced that the rules of the game must be clear for the participants. And these rules can only be visible and clear for the participants if we commit ourselves, if the experimenters commit themselves to not lie to their subjects. And due to this reason, so it's a lot of importance put on the fact that we want to build up a reputation that we never lie. And this is, for example, one reason why economists and psychologists typically do not share one laboratory, because it does not work if you sometimes lie to your participants and sometimes you do not, because then they won't trust you when you claim that you're not lying to them.